Welcome to the U.S. Green Building Council of Texas presentation on Why the Best Practices app. My name is David McLean, and I have the privilege of being the chair of the USGBC Texas Best Practices Committee. What is the USGBC Texas Best Practices app? The USGBC Texas Best Practices app makes material the social, environmental, financial, and emerging equity performance outcome impacts of our built environment ecosystem decisions in monetized dollar cost benefits and dollar cost burdens language. The Best Practices app reinforces a value system that makes transparent and accessible to traditional and previously excluded built environment stakeholders a defendable lens through which everyone recognizes the same value of available people, profit, and planet opportunities. Why do we need the USGBC Texas Best Practices app? Definition: industry standards. These are voluntary agreements that establish requirements for products, practices, or operations in a given field. In the built environment, industry standards are established through consensus by impacted stakeholders from private and public professional organizations. Let's examine the current built environment sustainability movement. Here we have first cost along the horizontal axis. This bar is the life safety minimum. The vertical axis represents potential impact value. Any building construction that falls below the life safety minimum poses a potential life and safety risk to inhabitants. This bar represents published industry standards. The shaded blue area here represents the impact value above the life safety minimum that published industry standards can give to the community and our building inhabitants. Definition: mandatory minimum codes. These are the minimum locally adopted industry standards that built environment developers, designers, contractors, and operators are legally required to achieve and jurisdictions must enforce. Typically, mandatory minimum codes address fire, life safety, and energy efficiencies only, and are enforced inconsistently across projects and jurisdictions. Fact number one, it takes 3 to 7 years from their publication for industry standards to be adopted by municipalities as mandatory minimum codes. Fact number two, it can take 5 to 7 years for municipalities to fully enforce the mandatory minimum codes they have adopted. Fact number three, the cumulative result of facts number one and number two is that buildings and communities are being created today that achieve minimum requirements 8 to 14 years behind and below recognized industry standards. Fact number four, of all the buildings we inhabit and in use today, less than 70% meet existing locally adopted mandatory minimum codes. This is the mandatory minimum code benchmark. The blue shaded area here represents the expected impact value that mandatory minimum codes will bring to communities and inhabitants. You will note that the mandatory minimum code bar is below currently published industry standards. The vertical axis bar then becomes the minimum benchmark or the market cost to achieve mandatory minimum code impacts. Fact number five, an institutionalized lowest first cost minimum code mentality is pervasive in the built environment ecosystem and is preventing the design, construction, and operation of safer, healthier, more efficient, and more prosperous places for us to live, learn, work, and play. We know how to do better, but choose to do less. Achieving the minimum has become the highest expected maximum. The shaded red area here represents where lowest first cost pressures drive the marketplace below the market value needed to achieve currently adopted mandatory minimum codes. Definition: professional standard of care. The professional shall perform its services consistent with the professional skill and care ordinarily provided by other professionals practicing in the same or similar locality under the same or similar circumstances. This means that the professional standard of care in your area is very much dependent on the quality of the professionals that you are competing with and the level of enforcement of local mandatory minimum codes. The blue area highlighted here represents where the lowest first cost mentality and lack of consistent enforcement of mandatory minimum codes have driven the professional standard of care. It is above the life safety line, so the buildings that we inhabit don't kill you immediately when you walk into them, but they fall below what is expected from communities that have adopted the mandatory minimum requirements. The built environment ecosystem is challenged just to enforce mandatory minimum codes and get the impact value that is possible to the community and our building inhabitants. It is obvious that we have institutionalized obstacles preventing the achievement of even mandatory minimum code requirements. So it's not unexpected that we have been less than successful in getting project teams to enter into the voluntary area above the mandatory minimum code requirements. Definition: best practice. A design, technology, policy, or process that is believed to bring some measure of benefit when compared to lowest first cost minimum code alternatives. Definition: proven best practice. An existing, mature, readily available, and deployable design, technology, policy, or process that can consistently prove positive business case dollar cost benefits when compared to lowest first cost minimum code alternatives. USGBC Texas does not consider a proven best practice unless the business case can be substantiated. Fact number 6. Designs, technologies, policies, and processes currently exist, and if deployed today, would immediately and equitably create exponential social, environmental, and financial benefits for building owners, inhabitants, and our communities. We do not need to wait for something new to be invented. This bar represents existing proven best practices and their capability to deliver more impact value above mandatory minimum codes. Fact number 7. The failure to implement and deploy proven best practices is not an availability, applicability, or appropriateness issue. It is a business case issue. The area then above the mandatory minimum code and below the best possible existing proven best practices is the missed opportunity. Put more bluntly, this is the social, environmental, and financial burden that inhabitants and tenant businesses must carry because the project has chosen not to implement proven best practices above the mandatory minimum requirement. Fact number 8. Less than 15% of today's new construction projects implement any type of above minimum code proven best practices. Another example of lowest first cost minimum code mentality at its finest. Fact number 9, developers, designers, operators, and regulatory agencies are not held legally, professionally, monetarily, ethically, or morally accountable for the social, environmental, or financial burdens that buildings and community inhabitants must shoulder when existing proven best practices are not implemented. And of course, there are emerging best practices that can also bring additional benefits to inhabitants and the community. So why not just raise the mandatory minimum code? Raising the mandatory minimum code increases the impact value to our community and inhabitants. The challenge, however, is that as we raise mandatory minimum codes to capture the impact value of proven best practices, there is typically an additional upfront first cost. This line represents the imagined trajectory of first cost as we attempt to achieve the benefits of existing proven best practices. The story goes that as we raise mandatory minimum codes to achieve the impact value of existing proven best practices, that first costs will follow this anticipated trajectory to achieve the impacts. The lowest first cost pervasive mentality in the built environment ecosystem then pushes back on the fear of rising prices. And puts downward pressure on municipalities looking to enforce higher standards of care. The result is that mandatory minimum codes lag well behind industry standards, and municipalities and inhabitants and communities are unable to take advantage of existing proven best practices. Fact number 9, over 80% of all buildings that will be in service by 2050 already exist today. The decisions we make today will have long-term impacts on future generations. Let's examine this incorrect assumption or relationship between first cost and ability to increase impact value from existing proven best practices. This myopic focus on first cost is preventing us from having meaningful conversations about the impact value. Our inability to push back against the first cost argument lies in the fact that we have been unable in the past to quantify and agree on a value system for the impact that's provided by existing proven best practices. Fact number 10, developers and city planners build what the tenant, businesses, and inhabitants demand. Building inhabitants and tenant businesses are unaware of the social, environmental, and financial burdens they are being forced to carry, and therefore do not demand proven best practices. Our inability to agree on a standardized value system for the impact that comes from existing proven best practices has been the stumbling block to overcoming this lowest first cost minimum code argument. To address this issue, about 20 years ago, voluntary, above minimum code, independent, third-party verified green rating systems started to appear in the hopes that we could create agreement around what sustainability meant and start deploying more proven best practices. These green rating systems allowed you to spend more first cost, but actually get recognition for the impact value that you were achieving. Rating systems were tiered so that you could achieve more impact, get recognized for that typically cost more money. These independent, third-party verified, above minimum code green rating systems have been successful over the last 20 years in increasing our conversation and understanding of sustainability. Unfortunately, they have not been universally adopted as an agreed to standard valuation system. Fact number 11, less than 7% of all new construction achieves any above minimum code third-party verified green certification. Over the last 20 years, competing rating systems have emerged. All of these competing green rating systems were attempting to do a better job of increasing or accelerating the deployment of proven best practices. These rating systems have increased our conversations around sustainability, and it made it much easier for municipalities to implement stronger mandatory minimum codes. The raising of mandatory minimum codes still faces the same challenges as it had before, with inconsistent enforcement and the lowest first cost minimum code mentality. One of the other interesting things that has become apparent is that the cost to actually obtain these extra benefits once mandatory minimum codes are in place is a whole lot less than we had been led to believe. Also, it's not uncommon for good project teams to be able to implement not just mandatory minimum codes, but a lot of proven best practices at little or no cost to the client. The narrative that we have been told that first costs will increase significantly in order to obtain emerging best practices is incorrect. The marketplace is showing us that we are able to deploy proven best practices and benefit from the impact value at a significantly lower first cost than previously anticipated. Fact number 12. Mandatory minimum code performance outcomes are assumed to be correct on all projects. However, most projects never confirm this. For example, no school ever built or being built in Texas is required to confirm that the indoor air quality is achieving any past or current minimum code requirement. In the past few years, conversations have changed significantly. We've gone from what it costs to what is it worth. They've changed from should we do sustainability to how should we do sustainability, and the ecosystem is asking for tools that allow us to compare and trade off designs and strategies quickly and consistently and repetitively. Fact 13. A very large community of professionals, advocates, and activists are passionate about know-how and are attempting to deploy proven best practices every day. Most developers, architects, and municipal planners don't wake up every day excited about creating another minimum code, lowest first cost project. Our USGBC Texas Best Practices Committee supports these passionate and knowledgeable individuals by supporting the mission of USGBC Texas that is supported by 4 pillars: equity, health and wellness, resilience, and sustainability. The USGBC Texas mission It's focused on uniting all stakeholders involved in the development, design, construction, operation, and use of the built infrastructure to achieve equitable practices and policies that are economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable. Our USGBC Texas Best Practices Committee supports this mission by accelerating the deployment of sustainable, proven best practices equitably in all sectors of the built environment by creating tools, communication pathways, and strong professional community relationships. The USGBC Texas Best Practices app provides all built environment ecosystem stakeholders unfiltered and unbiased access to defendable, globally recognized analysis and methodologies, proving the business case substantiations essential for justification of immediate deployment and sustained enjoyment of proven best practice benefits. The USGBC Texas Best Practices app exposes the full social, environmental, financial, and emerging equity cost burdens that minimum code, lowest first cost design, construction, and operational decisions place on our businesses and community inhabitants in net present value dollars. Green rating systems are not mandatory. The USGBC Texas Best Practices app connects built environment creators, influencers, and inhabitants directly to our passionate and knowledgeable best practice champions, who will show them how to emulate their superpowers, allowing immediate deployment of proven best practices in their buildings and communities. So, as I mentioned earlier, this impact value relationship to first cost is extremely important. We reviewed voluntary above minimum code, independent, third-party verified green rating systems, and the attempt to create a universal standard for the evaluation of proven best practices, and their proliferation and the impact that that has had, both positive and negative. Our USGBC Texas Best Practices app directly addresses the impact value vacuum or lack of standardized evaluation process for existing proven best practices. The Best Practices app does not create another value system. It relies on one that everybody understands, and that's money. We are taking the impact that comes from existing proven best practices and turn that into dollars in social, environmental, and financial buckets. Definition: proven best practice business case. An analysis of alternative built environment proven best practices that monetizes the short and long-term social, environmental, financial, and emerging equity net present value dollar cost benefits impacting our businesses, inhabitants, and communities. So for the USGBC Texas, a best practice is not a best practice unless we have a proven best practice business case. Fact 14. Built environment tenant businesses and inhabitants have had no mechanism to understand or quantify how buildings and communities impact our personal health or business prosperity in dollar cost benefits or dollar cost burdens. Inhabitants must rely on anonymous professionals to be the best stewards of their health and prosperity. Refer back to professional standard of care. The Best Practices app incorporates a number of very unique and powerful features that allow us to evaluate almost all design characteristics that impact performance outcomes for both building and site, and put those in financial, social, and environmental buckets that allow stakeholders to evaluate which proven best practices they should spend their money on. Project impacts and co-benefits are evaluated through peer-reviewed literature and assigned value, and that is the information that's put into the Best Practices app as a business case. For illustration purposes, we're going to talk about the office building that is modeled in the app. The climate modeling, carbon and pollution is for Houston, Texas. This is a 350,000 square foot, 14-story professional office building. We have conducted a 50-year triple bottom line cost benefit economic analysis with net present values all brought back to 2022 years. There's 1,500 employees with average salary and benefits of over $105,000 a year. That is $7.9 billion of benefits over the 50-year life cycle of the building. For comparison, the total energy use of the building is $27 million over that 50-year period. That means that energy costs are 0.35% of the total building business's benefits cost. Why this is important is the typical professional office building operational cost spends less than 1% on energy. That tenant business spends 90% of its operational annual budget on staff, salaries, and benefits. Let's enter the app. The app has both the opportunity to evaluate proven best practices within a Houston, Texas middle school or a Houston, Texas professional office building. Simply choose which building type you want to evaluate and pick your best practice, in this case, daylighting. Once you select your best practice, the default social, environmental, financial, and total benefits for the better solution will appear. The 0 is the minimum code alternative. And then you have the social, environmental, and financial, and total triple bottom line cost benefit analysis, NPV, shown here. Turning your smartphone or device into landscape mode allows you to see this information in more detail. Speaking to the daylighting best practices in the app, there are no minimum code exists for daylighting. Inhabitants are not entitled to be provided natural daylight. The minimum code lowest first cost office building we have modeled in the app has a baseline of 50% of the occupants have access to appropriate daylighting. The better alternative has 75% accessible to daylighting and a 2% energy efficiency increase. The best alternative, 100% of occupants have access to appropriate daylighting, and there's a 4% lighting energy savings. We're going to dig deeper into the data that's behind the information that I just showed you in the app. 0 represents the lowest first cost minimum code baseline. The better daylighting alternative in the app has a CapEx of $150,000 above the lowest first cost minimum baseline. The best daylighting alternative has a added CapEx of $300,000 above the minimum code lowest first cost baseline. Now we're going to add the financial savings from electricity. 2% better for the better daylighting option, and 4% better for the best daylighting option. The net financial graphs here show the first cost and energy savings impact. They're both negative, and this is why the myopic focus on lowest first cost rules out daylighting instantly. What doesn't typically get evaluated in the lowest first cost scenario is the value of the carbon emissions that are removed from the community because of the higher efficiency. There is also a value for the air pollution burden that's been removed from the community because of the higher efficiency. Here we look at the productivity, and as you can see, the other upfront capital costs, carbon emissions, social value of air pollution, and financial savings from electricity pale in comparison. All of this value then from these best practices goes directly to the tenant businesses. Adding in the health impact makes it painfully obvious that spaces where tenant businesses are not afforded the opportunity to have good daylighting does hinder their businesses' prosperity and their employees' health. Looking only at the upfront financial decision, it's obvious that daylighting does not look that attractive. However, when these decisions are being made, the tenant business is not in the room. When we look at the environmental impact of deploying proven best practices, it is more significant than the financial impact. But again, the community is not in the room when these decisions are being made. The Best Practices app makes transparent the full social, environmental, and financial impacts of projects to both traditional stakeholders and those previously excluded from the decision-making process. The building owner has made a very quick one-dimensional lowest first cost decision based on daylighting. The community is not at the table, and the project team cannot be forced to deploy any proven best practice, let alone daylighting, that's above minimum code that would remove this burden from the community. And the tenant businesses and inhabitants of our communities and buildings have been unaware that decisions are being made that preclude them from the benefits that are possible with the deployment of proven best practices. Other features of the app is that it allows you to compare not only one best practice, better alternative against a best alternative, it also allows you to compare one best practice to another best practice. This business case substantiation then becomes even more important if you were, say, a tenant business looking to move into a building and you had $500,000 to spend on either daylighting or higher energy efficiency. That same money has a completely different impact on your business's bottom line. Here we can see a significantly different outcome to the tenant business for their investment. The energy efficiency option or investment brings no real value to the tenant business's profitability or prosperity. If you are the owner of the building, however, and cannot sell these benefits to the tenant businesses, you're only looking at lowest upfront first cost. In this case, the daylighting best practice results in a negative $35,000, whereas the energy efficiency option shows a positive $3.7 million over the life of the property. This graph then represents how the best practices fall out with respect to increased first cost and the total net present value across the social, environmental, and financial value that they bring. We can compare, for example, here, a better water efficiency to the best water efficiency possible above minimum code. Or we can compare the best energy efficiency to the best daylighting. This allows us to make more informed decisions and allows us to align our business model with our employees' health and our prosperity. So far in this presentation, we have reviewed what the Best Practices app is. We've reviewed why it's important and how we create the business case and the value system to move forward in the deployment of proven best practices. This is the how section. This is how you engage with our USGBC Texas Best Practice champions, those passionate individuals who every day are working to deploy above minimum code proven best practices and are successful at it. You have direct access within the app to learn about our USGBC Texas Best Practices. Simply click the Committee tab. You will be taken to our list of USGBC Texas Best Practice champions. Simply click on their name, details about who they are, and their best practice superpowers appears. And if you want further information, click on the link that takes you to our USGBC Texas website database, where you can get in contact with that best practice champion. Access to all of our USGBC Texas best practice champions is free to USGBC Texas members, Texas school systems, and community-facing nonprofit organizations looking to solve built environment issues in their communities. So, in review, the Best Practices app makes material the social, environmental, financial, and emerging equity performance outcome impacts of our built environment ecosystem decisions in monetized dollar cost benefits and dollar cost burdens language. The USGBC Texas Best Practices app is business case performance outcome oriented. It reinforces a common value system based on net present value in dollars. It forces lowest first cost narratives to confront the net present value benefits or burdens of their decisions. No specialty green rating systems expertise is needed. And it gives previously excluded stakeholders access to data they can use to demand proven best practices in their projects. This is our call to action. We are all accountable, both individually and collectively, for the social, environmental, and financial burdens lowest first cost decisions create. You now have the tools and superpower accessibility needed to achieve a safe, healthy, efficient, and prosperous future. For further details on the USGBC Texas Best Practices app, you can go to the website shown here. Currently, the app is in Android platform only. If you don't have an Android app, you can go to our YouTube channel and there's a demo how the app works. Feel free to reach out to me if you want more information on the details I've shared here today, or to our Executive Director, Jonathan Kratz, who will help you get access to the Best Practices Champion database. Thank you very much.